The November night descended on Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, bringing with it a biting chill and a dense fog that hung in the air like milk. The fog clung to the ground, swallowing the weak glow of the streetlights and making the familiar sounds of the sleeping city feel distant and ethereal. In this near absolute stillness, only one sound was steady and powerful, ceaseless. It was the rhythmic grinding of steel wheels on the rails from Freight Train 734, a colossal metal serpent slithering through the night, hauling goods on a predetermined schedule. At a railroad crossing on the outskirts of the city, Mr. Miller, a crossing guard with over 20 years of experience, sat in his small guardhouse, sipping a cup of hot tea to ward off the cold and drowsiness. His job was a monotonous repetition. Only the distant sound of a train horn and the bright glare of a headlight were the signals that he needed to go outside, lower the crossing gate, and ensure the safety of passers-by. According to the schedule, Train 734 was due to pass his post in about 15 minutes. But at exactly 4:15 a.m. on the morning of November 19, 2017, an unusual, jarring sound tore through the quiet night. It was the desperate, piercing screech of the train's brakes. The shriek of metal grinding against metal created a horrific sound that stretched for hundreds of yards, accompanied by a violent jolt that made the very ground tremble. The freight train, weighing thousands of tons, had engaged its emergency brake, an extremely rare event, unless there was a serious incident. Mr. Miller jumped, rushing out of the guardhouse. From his position, he could see the train had come to a complete stop up ahead, about 200 yards from his post. The powerful headlight of the locomotive was still shining straight ahead, illuminating a stretch of track, hazy in the fog. An instinct told him something was terribly wrong. Mr. Miller grabbed a high-powered flashlight and hurried down the tracks toward the engine. When he arrived, the engineer and his assistant, their faces drained of all color, were trembling as they climbed down from the cabin. The engineer, an experienced middle-aged man, stammered and pointed toward the front of the locomotive, his voice lost in panic. He managed to say that there was someone dead, someone lying on the tracks. He explained that he had seen them from a distance but could not stop in time. Mr. Miller shone his flashlight in the direction the engineer was pointing. His heart seemed to stop. Underneath the massive locomotive, a horrifying sight was revealed. It was the body of a woman. The body was no longer intact, horribly mangled after being run over by the train's wheels. Fresh blood and body parts were scattered across the gravel ballast and railroad ties, creating a gruesome and deeply disturbing scene. Though he had lived for nearly half a century and witnessed many accidents, the sight before him made even the seasoned crossing guard turn his face away, his stomach churning with nausea. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911 to report it to the Chambersburg Police Department. In less than 20 minutes, the first police cars, sirens wailing, shattered the deadly silence as they raced to the scene. Police quickly cordoned off the entire area, stretching hundreds of yards of yellow tape to prevent anyone unauthorized from approaching. The city's police chief and specialized units, including the homicide squad, railroad traffic police, and representatives from the district attorney's office, arrived one by one. Initially, based on the engineer's statement and a preliminary look at the scene, almost everyone came to the same conclusion. This was a tragic suicide. The engineer stated unequivocally that when the train was about 300 yards away, he had clearly seen a person lying motionless across the tracks in the beam of his headlight. He had blasted the horn and immediately activated the emergency brake system. But given the speed and weight of a freight train, the minimum braking distance was nearly 500 yards. A timely stop was impossible. This testimony, combined with the fact that the victim was a young woman, led the investigators' thoughts to a familiar scenario. A young girl, heartbroken or facing a crisis, had chosen a tragic way to end her life. However, investigative protocol does not allow for hasty conclusions. A task force, led by Detective Lieutenant Frank Costello, the deputy chief of police known for his meticulousness and sharp intellect, was formed right at the scene. He demanded that the forensics team conduct their work with extreme thoroughness, not to overlook a single detail, no matter how small. Among the members of the forensics team was Dr. Ben Carter, a young forensic pathologist who had already made a name for himself in the field for his keen powers of observation and distinct logical thinking. While his colleagues were focused on collecting the victim's remains and photographing the scene, Dr. Carter quietly went about his work methodically. He was not just interested in the fatal injuries, he paid close attention to the peripheral details, things that seemed unrelated. He carefully examined the remaining parts of the victim's body. The victim was a young woman, likely under 30, with long, chestnut-colored hair. She was wearing a flimsy silk nightgown, wholly unsuitable for the cold night air. And then, as Dr. Carter's eyes moved down to the victim's feet, an extremely illogical detail, a fatally abnormal clue, caught his attention. The victim was wearing a pair of silk socks, the thin kind that came up to the ankle. And the strange thing was, the socks were perfectly clean. They were not stained with a speck of mud, grease, or even dust. They were unusually pristine, as if she had just put them on in a spotlessly clean room. Dr. Carter narrowed his eyes, a huge contradiction immediately forming in his mind. He looked down at the ground around him. This area of the track was incredibly dirty. The ground was damp from the night's dew, mixed with sharp-edged gravel, coal dust, and dark grease slicks that had leaked from passing trains. To walk from the nearest public road, over 50 yards away, to this spot and lie down, it would be impossible for anyone to keep their socks so clean. They would surely be stained with mud or at least torn and frayed by the gravel. The unreasonable cleanliness of the silk socks could only lead to one conclusion. The victim had not walked here on her own. She had been carried or brought to the scene by someone and placed gently on the rails. She was already unconscious or dead before she was laid down. This discovery was like a thunderclap, shattering the entire suicide theory. Dr. Carter immediately reported his findings to Lieutenant Costello. The task force leader, after stooping down to personally examine the strangely clean socks, said nothing. His face hardened, his initial expression replaced by deep contemplation. He understood that his young forensic pathologist might have just found the key to turn the entire case on its head. A few hours later, at the county medical examiner's office, the results of the detailed autopsy were officially released, and they turned Dr. Carter's suspicions into a refutable fact. Lieutenant Frank Costello convened an emergency meeting of the task force. He announced two critical findings, two horrifying truths that had been concealed under the guise of a suicide. First, the direct cause of the victim's death was not being hit by the train. The autopsy showed the victim had died approximately 1 to 2 hours prior. The cause of death was determined to be mechanical asphyxiation. On the victim's neck, though deformed, the pathologists found very deep ligature marks, consistent with strangulation by a thin, soft cord. The killer had strangled the victim to death, then brought her body to the tracks to stage a suicide, using the force of the train to destroy evidence. Second, and even more shocking, the tests revealed that the victim was 3 months pregnant. The entire task force was plunged into silence. The suicide theory had been completely debunked. The case was now reclassified for what it was, a murder and disposal of a body, committed with a sophisticated and cruel methodology. The killer had not taken one life, but two. The victim was not just a young woman, she was a mother-to-be. The killer's motive had just become much more complex. It could be a love affair gone wrong, or an attempt to conceal the pregnancy. However, the task force faced a massive hurdle right from the start, identifying the victim. She had no identification on her. Her face was completely destroyed. Identification seemed impossible. Investigating a murder without knowing who the victim is like finding a needle in a haystack. The vicious killer seemed to have calculated everything to erase all traces, to erase the victim's very existence. But he had not anticipated leaving behind one seemingly harmless detail, a pair of clean silk socks, and that very detail had exposed his entire charade. The truth revealed from the autopsy room dealt a heavy blow to the entire task force. It not only confirmed a murder, but painted a picture of a crime with savage and despicable details far beyond their initial assumptions. A young woman, carrying a small life within her, had been strangled to death and then placed on a railroad track in a suicide scene calculated down to the last detail. The air in the conference room at the Chambersburg Police Department grew thick, heavy with indignation and the immense challenges that lay ahead. Lieutenant Frank Costello stood before the whiteboard, on which the first crime scene photos were pinned. He took a red marker and drew a firm, decisive line through the words "suspected suicide." Beside it, he wrote the new classification in clear, sharp letters: homicide body disposal. His low and steely voice echoed in the silence of the room as he stated that the play was over. He explained that they were dealing with a perpetrator who was not only ruthless but also extremely cunning and cold-headed. He had planned for the train to become his tool for destroying evidence, to destroy the victim's face, and to erase her identity, and he had almost succeeded. He declared that their most urgent, #1 task, before they could even think about finding the killer, was to answer the question of who the victim was. This was the biggest, almost insurmountable wall the task force was facing. A homicide investigation without the victim's identity was like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly in a sea of information. The perpetrator had intentionally tried to make the victim a Jane Doe, and nobody, to sever all connections, all clues that could lead back to him. Standard investigative procedures were immediately deployed. Dr. Ben Carter and the forensics team worked tirelessly to collect any remaining identifying features. They lifted fingerprints from the intact parts of the body, created a dental profile based on the victim's tooth structure, and most importantly, extracted a DNA sample. These were unique, undeniable biological signatures. However, all this valuable data would be useless without a corresponding file in an existing database for comparison. They were like golden keys, but the task force did not know which lock to try. In parallel, another investigative team, led by a homicide squad sergeant, began a massive search through paper records. An urgent request was sent out to the police departments of all towns and cities in the county, as well as in adjacent states like Maryland, Ohio, New Jersey, and West Virginia. The directive was to re-examine all missing person reports filed within the last month, with a special focus on cases involving young women between the ages of 20 and 30. Dozens, then hundreds of files poured in. Investigators worked day and night, their eyes glued to towering stacks of documents, comparing every small detail. Estimated height, hair color, and identifying marks like moles or scars were all meticulously cross-referenced. There were a few cases that were flagged as high probability. For instance, a file from a nearby county reported a missing 25-year-old girl of similar height. The task force immediately contacted the family, but after reviewing the remaining characteristics, they painfully confirmed it was not their daughter. Another case in Philadelphia involved a daughter who went missing after an argument, but when the dental records were compared, they did not match at all. The wide-ranging search, despite being conducted with maximum effort, yielded no results. This pointed to a frightening possibility. The victim might not be a local, or, for some reason, her disappearance had not been reported to the police by her family or friends. The investigation seemed to be heading into a dark dead end. Pressure from the public and from superiors began to mount. The case of the Jane Doe on the tracks had caused significant alarm in the community. Bizarre and ghoulish rumors began to spread, hampering the investigation. Amidst the deadlock and overwhelming stress, Lieutenant Costello made a decision that was considered quite risky but was also the only ray of hope. He decided to release information about the case to the media, to use the power of the community to find a lead. This was a double-edged sword. Publicizing the information could tip off the killer, making him hide even deeper or try to destroy any remaining evidence. But in this situation, the task force had no other choice. However, the question was what information to release. The victim's face was destroyed, unidentifiable. General physical descriptions were too vague. They needed something specific, a unique piece of evidence that could jog someone's memory, a detail that only those close to the victim would recognize. Once again, Dr. Ben Carter provided a crucial suggestion. He recalled that during the autopsy, aside from the clean silk socks, he had noticed another small detail. On the victim's ears, though deformed, she was still wearing a pair of silver earrings. They had not been dislodged during the impact, perhaps because they were securely fastened. The earrings had a very distinctive design, the shape of a small, intricately crafted daisy. It did not look like the mass-produced jewelry sold everywhere. It was very likely a custom-made piece or part of a limited collection. The idea was immediately approved by Lieutenant Costello. The silver daisy earrings became the most important piece of evidence, the last hope to break the wall of silence surrounding the case. The crime scene unit carefully removed the earrings, cleaned them, and took the clearest possible photos from multiple angles. A brief press release was drafted. It stated that the Chambersburg Police Department was investigating a case involving an unidentified female victim, aged 25 to 30, approximately 5 feet 3 inches tall. Accompanying the text was the image of the silver daisy earrings. The police called for anyone who recognized the earrings or had information about a missing woman with similar characteristics to immediately contact the investigation via a dedicated hotline. The information and image were quickly published in local newspapers, on online news sites, and broadcast on the local television and radio stations. The investigation had now expanded beyond the scope of those in uniform. It had become a search involving the entire community. The entire task force held its breath, waiting. Dozens of calls came into the hotline each day, but most were noise, useless information, or baseless speculation. The wait in vain began to wear on the officers' morale. But on the afternoon of the third day after the information was released, one phone call changed everything. The caller was an elderly man, his voice deliberate and somewhat hesitant. He introduced himself as Samuel Klein, the owner of a small jewelry store that had been in business for over 30 years in downtown Chambersburg. He said he had just read the story in the afternoon paper and was almost certain that the earrings in the photo were a product of his own handiwork. This information was as good as gold. Lieutenant Costello and a team of detectives immediately drove to Mr. Klein's jewelry store. It was a small, modest shop on an old street. The interior was steeped in time, with discolored glass display cases and handcrafted tools. Mr. Klein, an old artisan jeweler with white hair and calloused hands, welcomed them. Mr. Klein pointed a trembling finger at the picture of the earrings in the newspaper. He told the detectives that he was sure those were the earrings and that he could not be mistaken. He explained that the daisy design was his own and that he remembered every petal and every line. He had made that pair of earrings about a year ago. Lieutenant Costello asked, trying to contain the excitement in his voice, if he remembered who he had made them for. Mr. Klein paused for a moment, searching his memory. He replied that yes, he did. A custom piece like that, he would not forget. The customer was a fairly young man who said he wanted to order a very special gift for his wife. He had brought in a sketch of a daisy, explaining it was his wife's favorite flower. Mr. Klein had made it exactly to his specifications. The lieutenant asked if he had any information about the customer, like a name, phone number, or address. Mr. Klein explained that in a craft like his, they rarely wrote down such details, but asked them to wait a moment. He then slowly walked to the back, rummaging through an old drawer. A moment later, he returned, holding a worn, leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the pages, his eyes squinting under his reading glasses. He exclaimed softly that he had found it. He had written down the customer's name and phone number to contact him when it was finished. The name was David Morgan, and the phone number was right there. Mr. Klein pointed to a line of handwritten text in the book. Lieutenant Costello could hardly believe his eyes. After so many days of searching in vain, they finally had a name, a phone number. A fragile link had been connected to the anonymous victim. Without a moment's delay, measures were taken to identify the man named David Morgan. Based on the phone number, they quickly obtained his registered address. David Morgan, 32, a construction engineer, currently residing in an apartment complex in Chambersburg. A team was ordered to approach Mr. Morgan as discreetly as possible. When investigators arrived at Morgan's apartment that evening, he was utterly shocked and bewildered by the purpose of their visit. When shown the photo of the earrings, his face turned pale. He confirmed with a trembling voice that it was the gift he had custom ordered for his wife, Leah Morgan, 29. He stammered, his voice filled with panic, asking where his wife was and if something had happened to her. When informed of the tragedy that had occurred, David Morgan nearly collapsed. He broke down, sobbing in agony. After so many days as a nameless phantom, the victim finally had a name. She was Leah Morgan. The first and largest wall of mystery in the case had been broken down. The investigation now had a clear direction, and the first person they needed to talk to was her husband, David Morgan. The identification of the victim, Leah Morgan, was a pivotal breakthrough that pulled the case out of the fog of uncertainty. From a nameless, faceless ghost, the victim now had a past, a family, and relationships. Those relationships were the threads the task force could follow to find the killer. And the first, closest thread they had to grasp was none other than David Morgan, the victim's husband. After the initial shock and an exhaustive crying spell at his home, David Morgan was invited by investigators to the Chambersburg Police Department for questioning. He was brought into an interrogation room, not as a simple witness, but as the number one person of interest. In any homicide where the victim is married, the spouse is always the first and most natural subject of suspicion. Sitting opposite Lieutenant Frank Costello and another detective, David Morgan looked utterly devastated. The pain of losing his wife was evident on his pale face, his eyes red and swollen. He sat silently, his hands clasped together on the cold steel table. Lieutenant Costello began the interview slowly, his tone calm and empathetic, but behind it was a sharpness that missed no detail. Lieutenant Costello began by expressing his condolences for Morgan's loss. He explained that to find the person who committed the crime, they needed his absolute cooperation. He asked Morgan to remain calm, try to remember, and answer all questions accurately, and asked if he understood. Morgan nodded slightly, unable to speak. The lieutenant first asked him to tell them about the relationship between him and his wife, Leah Morgan. Taking a deep breath to compose himself, Morgan began to tell his story, his voice hoarse and broken. He confirmed that Leah Morgan was his legal wife and that they had been married for 3 years. The silver daisy earrings were an anniversary gift he had specially commissioned for her because it was her favorite flower. He spoke of their happy early days, of the future plans they had made together. However, when asked about the current state of their relationship, Morgan hesitated for a long time before reluctantly admitting that they had been separated. This information immediately caught the investigators' attention. Marital conflict is one of the most common motives for murder. Lieutenant Costello asked Morgan to elaborate. Morgan explained that their marriage had started to crack about a year ago. The cause was not a third person, but mainly irreconcilable differences in personality and life outlook. Morgan was a construction engineer with a straightforward job and a rather quiet, introverted personality. He just wanted a peaceful, simple family life. In contrast, Leah was a beautiful, energetic woman, somewhat of a partygoer who enjoyed socializing. She worked for an event planning company, an environment that required extensive networking and complex social relationships. That difference gradually created an invisible chasm between them. Arguments became more frequent. Morgan said, his voice filled with bitterness, that she had called him boring and lacking in ambition. He, in turn, could not stand her constantly coming home late, partying with friends, and having relationships that he could not control. They had tried to patch things up, but they could not. Finally, about 6 months ago, they decided to separate. She moved out and rented her own apartment to give them both space to think. They had not filed for divorce, yet they were just temporarily living apart. The detective next to him asked when the last time he saw Leah was. Morgan closed his eyes, trying to search his memory. He recalled it was about 2 weeks ago. She had come back to the house to pick up a few personal items she had left behind. They had only exchanged a few pleasantries, and then she left. The conversation had been very normal, with no arguments. The interrogation continued, delving into more sensitive details. And then, Lieutenant Costello dropped a decisive question, a real bombshell. He asked Mr. Morgan if he knew that at the time of her death, his wife Leah was pregnant. David Morgan's head snapped up, his eyes wide with utter astonishment. The shock on his face did not look like an act. He exclaimed, questioning what the lieutenant had said and insisting that she could not have been pregnant and that there must be some mistake. Lieutenant Costello affirmed that the medical examiner's findings were not mistaken. He looked Morgan directly in the eyes, not missing a single expression, and stated that the victim was 3 months pregnant. He then asked if Morgan knew anything about the pregnancy and if it was his. Morgan was completely stunned. He shook his head unconsciously, mumbling incoherently. He insisted it was not his, that it definitely was not his. He explained that they had not lived together for almost half a year and had not been intimate. He repeatedly claimed he knew nothing about it. Morgan's shock and extreme pain seemed genuine. He had just learned his wife had been murdered, and now he had to face another brutal truth. His wife was pregnant with another man's child. The pain of a betrayed husband and the pain of losing a loved one merged, causing him to nearly break down completely. However, for the task force, this information opened a new, logical line of reasoning. If Morgan was telling the truth that he was not the father, then Leah's pregnancy became a perfect motive for murder for him. A man's honor wounded, jealousy all could lead to an impulsive, uncontrolled act. Noticing Morgan's extreme psychological distress, Lieutenant Costello decided to switch to another key question for verification. He asked Mr. Morgan where he was and what he was doing on the night of November 18th and the early morning of November 19th. This was the question every suspect must face. Morgan took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He stated that he was at home that night, alone. He had gotten home from work at 6 p.m., had dinner, watched some TV, and then went to bed. He did not go anywhere until he left for work the next morning. A weak alibi. Being home alone is not a solid alibi. However, Lieutenant Costello pressed on, asking if he was sure and if anyone or anything could verify he was at home all night. Morgan hesitated for a moment, then said his apartment building had security cameras in the hallway and the lobby that they could check. He was certain the camera would show him coming home from work and not leaving the building until the next morning. He added that his phone was also at home all night and they could check the location data. This statement made the task force take special note. Immediately, a team was dispatched to Morgan's apartment building to extract all security camera footage from the time in question. Another request was sent to the technical unit to determine the location history of the phone number Morgan was using. While waiting for the verification results, the interrogation continued. As he gradually calmed down, Morgan provided some more important information. He said that although they were separated, he had heard through mutual friends that after moving out, Leah had been living a rather complicated life. She was often out late, attended parties, and was acquainted with many wealthy, successful men. He did not know who specifically, but he suspected his wife was in another romantic relationship. A few hours later, the results of the alibi verification came back, and they were a huge surprise. The data from the apartment building's security cameras perfectly matched Morgan's statement. The camera clearly recorded him taking the elevator to his apartment at just after 6 p.m. on the 18th, and there was no footage of him leaving the building until 7 a.m. the next day. Location data from cell tower pings also confirmed that his phone did not move from the coverage area of his apartment complex from the evening of the 18th to the morning of the 19th. David Morgan's alibi was rock solid, nearly irrefutable. The theory of a jealous husband murdering his wife was almost entirely dismissed. The investigation once again stood at a critical crossroads. If it was not the husband, then who was the killer? The baby in Leah's womb now became the focal point of the case. The man who had gotten her pregnant, the victim's secret lover, now emerged as the number one suspect. It was highly possible that when confronted by Leah about the pregnancy and perhaps pressured to take responsibility, this man, in order to protect his family, honor, or career, had brutally murdered both mother and child to silence them. The task force determined they had to reconstruct the entire secret life of Leah Morgan. They needed to know where she went, who she met, and most importantly, who was the man she had been seeing for the past 6 months. Lieutenant Costello ordered all resources to be focused on this direction. An urgent request was sent to the high-tech crimes unit. By any means necessary, they had to recover all the data from the victim's phone, computer, and especially her cloud storage accounts. There, in the digital world, they hoped to find the faces of her secret lovers, and among them, very possibly, the face of a murderer. The fact that David Morgan, the victim's husband, had an irrefutable alibi pushed the investigation in a completely new, more complex, and murkier direction. The case was no longer a simple domestic tragedy. It had revealed a hidden corner, a secret life of Leah Morgan that even her own husband knew nothing about. The 3-month-old fetus in her womb was now not just a tragic detail, but had become the clearest and sharpest motive for murder. The man who had left his seed in Leah, the mysterious lover who likely had his own life and family to hide, emerged as the prime suspect. The task force's mission was now to paint a complete picture of the victim's life during her 6 months of separation. They needed to flip through every page of her secret diary, a diary not written with ink on paper, but stored as lines of digital data in the virtual world. Lieutenant Costello assembled the best information technology experts from the Pennsylvania State Police. The directive was to recover and analyze all data from the victim's electronic devices, including the shattered cell phone from the crime scene and the laptop recovered from the apartment she rented. The work was incredibly difficult. The phone was severely damaged, but with specialized equipment, experts could still extract data from the SIM card and parts of the internal memory. The laptop was protected by a complex password. After many days and nights of relentless work using technical and forensic methods, the final security wall was breached. And what appeared before the investigators' eyes was truly staggering. The data recovered from emails, messaging apps like WhatsApp and Signal, and especially cloud storage accounts like iCloud and Google Drive, painted a completely different picture of Leah Morgan. She did not have just one lover. Her romantic life was far more complicated and entangled. Messages, photos, and private journal entries showed that during her 6-month separation, Leah had maintained parallel romantic relationships with at least 3 different men. And the frightening commonality among all three was that they were all married men with established social standing and solid financial means. Leah seemed to have plunged into a dangerous game of love, a complex four-way relationship where any breakdown could lead to disastrous consequences. The profiles of the three secret lovers were quickly established. The first was Richard Sterling, 52, the director of a large logistics company based in Philadelphia. Sterling was the oldest, with a wife and 2 children studying abroad. His relationship with Leah began at an event organized by her company. The messages between them showed a transactional arrangement. Sterling provided Leah with a significant monthly allowance, and in return, she would be his mistress during his business trips or whenever he felt lonely. The second was Victor Russo, 45, a well-known construction contractor in Chambersburg. Russo was married with 3 children. He met Leah through a mutual friend. Their relationship was more colored by passion and physical intimacy. Intimate photos stored in a secret folder showed they frequently met at luxury hotels. The third, and the one who had the closest and most frequent relationship with Leah in the last 3 months, was Dr. Marcus Thorne, 40, a highly skilled surgeon working at Chambersburg General Hospital. Dr. Thorne was described as a suave, eloquent man who had a family many admired, with a beautiful wife and 2 well-behaved children. The messages between Dr. Thorne and Leah showed a deeper attachment and affection than the other 2. They often shared private thoughts and made promises about some distant future. The emergence of these 3 new suspects pushed the investigation into a completely new phase. Any one of these 3 men could be the father of the child, and therefore could also be the killer. Their motives were all the same: to protect the families, reputations, and careers they had spent their entire lives building. The fact that Leah was pregnant and might have used the pregnancy to threaten them or demand a formal relationship could very well have been the last straw, pushing one of them to commit a criminal act. The task force decided to investigate and interview all 3 suspects simultaneously, with extreme caution and secrecy. Any slip-up could alert the subjects and give them time to prepare a defense. The first suspect to be visited was Richard Sterling. A team went to his company headquarters in Philadelphia under the guise of a routine security matter. Initially, Sterling acted very surprised and denied any relationship with a woman named Leah Morgan. However, when investigators presented him with undeniable text messages, his expression changed. He finally had to admit to his extramarital affair, but when asked for his alibi on the night of the murder, Sterling breathed a sigh of relief. He produced plane tickets, hotel receipts, and a detailed work schedule proving that during that entire week, he was on a business trip in Los Angeles, nearly 3,000 miles from the crime scene. Richard Sterling's alibi was perfect. He was cleared from the list of suspects. The second suspect, Victor Russo, was also brought in for questioning in Chambersburg. Like Sterling, Russo initially denied everything vehemently, but faced with evidence of his hotel rendezvous, he had to bow his head and admit it. However, Russo also had an incredibly solid alibi. On the very night Leah was murdered, his family was hosting a huge birthday party for his youngest son at their home. The party was attended by dozens of people, including relatives, friends, and business partners. Dozens of witnesses all confirmed that Russo was at home, hosting guests and celebrating all evening until late at night. The idea that he could slip away from such a crowded party to commit murder was impossible. Victor Russo was also cleared of suspicion. The investigation now focused all its attention on the final suspect, Dr. Marcus Thorne. Compared to the other 2, he had the deepest emotional relationship with the victim and was the most likely to be the father of the child. A team led by Lieutenant Costello himself went to the General Hospital to speak directly with Dr. Thorne. Contrary to expectations, Dr. Thorne was extremely calm, even cold. When shown a photo of Leah, he merely glanced at it before shaking his head and firmly saying that he did not know the person. His blatant denial, even when investigators presented the affectionate messages between them, showed he was an extremely stubborn subject with a strong psyche. He insisted that his account had been hacked or that someone was deliberately framing him. When asked for his alibi, Dr. Thorne was rather evasive. He said that he was on call at the hospital that night. However, when detectives quietly checked the duty roster, they discovered it was not Dr. Thorne's shift. When confronted with this contradiction, he changed his story, saying he had been mistaken and that he was at home with his wife and children that night. The evasiveness and inconsistency in his statements made the task force's suspicions of Dr. Thorne grow stronger. The decisive blow was struck when Lieutenant Costello suggested Dr. Thorne cooperate by providing a DNA sample for comparison with the fetus's DNA and traces found at the scene, in order to prove his innocence. Faced with this request, Dr. Thorne reacted extremely aggressively. He cited all sorts of reasons, from privacy rights to claiming it was an insult, to refuse. He said he would only provide a sample with a court order. This vehement refusal was, to experienced investigators, tantamount to a confession. An innocent person would never react so negatively and fearfully to a scientific and objective request. Leaving the hospital, Lieutenant Costello stated firmly to his colleagues that there was no doubt anymore and that the killer was Dr. Marcus Thorne. He was just trying to stall. Costello decided they did not have time to wait for a court-ordered DNA test, and that they needed to focus all resources on finding other physical evidence to convict him. He ordered a search of every security camera system on every route Thorne could have taken on the night of the murder, believing he could not be a ghost. The investigation had reached its final stretch. The killer had been exposed, but he was hiding behind the cloak of a respected doctor and a chilling stubbornness. A battle of wits and a race to find evidence had begun. The stubbornness and aggressive reaction of Dr. Marcus Thorne to the request for a DNA sample did not extinguish suspicion. On the contrary, it acted as a catalyst, cementing the ironclad belief in Lieutenant Costello and the entire task force. The killer was him. An innocent man would never fear scientific truth. Thorne's refusal was not an act of protecting his privacy, but the final defense of a cornered animal, a desperate attempt to stall, to hope for some miracle that could help him escape justice. But in the world of criminal investigation, there is no room for miracles, only evidence and logic. Lieutenant Costello understood that while a court-ordered DNA test was inevitable, waiting would give the subject more time to prepare, to create new false narratives, or even to destroy any other remaining evidence. The order was given decisively. Focus all forces on attacking the only weak point in his statement, his vague alibi. Dr. Thorne said he was at home all night, a lie the task force was convinced they could expose with the help of the unblinking eyes that never sleep, security cameras. A large-scale, unprecedented review of security camera footage across the city of Chambersburg was launched. It was a colossal task that demanded extreme patience and meticulousness. 3 teams, each comprising the most elite and tech-savvy detectives, were formed. Their mission was to collect and analyze data from every possible security camera from the night of November 18th to the morning of the 19th on all routes potentially connected to Dr. Thorne. Camera footage was collected from everywhere. First was the city's traffic monitoring system. Then came security cameras from businesses, stores, and most importantly, from hundreds of homeowners who had voluntarily installed them to protect their property. The detectives had to go door to door, patiently explaining and requesting cooperation. The Homicide Squad's office was transformed into a massive data analysis center. Dozens of computers ran at full capacity, 24/7. The air in the room was thick with the smell of coffee and tension. The officers' eyes were bloodshot, glued to screens replaying hundreds, thousands of hours of footage from different angles. They had to watch and re-watch soulless tapes of deserted streets in the middle of the night, searching for a single image, Dr. Marcus Thorne's black Mazda sedan. Days passed in fatigue and near hopelessness. The amount of data was overwhelming, and the images from many cameras were blurry and low quality due to nighttime lighting and fog. But no one gave up. And then, late one afternoon, their perseverance paid off. A soft cry of having found him echoed from a corner of the room. A young detective, after hours of staring without blinking, had spotted a crucial image. On a segment of tape from a security camera at a building supply store located on the main road leading out of the suburban community where Dr. Thorne lived, the familiar black Mazda had appeared. The timestamp was 10:15 p.m. on the 18th. The car was heading out of the city, in the opposite direction of the hospital. This discovery was a fatal blow, shattering Thorne's lie that he had been at home all night. He had lied. He was out on the night of the murder. From this initial lead, the search became more focused and efficient. The detectives began to leapfrog from one camera to the next, tracing the car's path. They saw it pass an intersection, turn onto a smaller road, and continue toward the outskirts of town. The car's trail led investigators down an unexpected route. It did not head straight for the railroad tracks but turned into an area with several small motels and hotels. and then the trail vanished when it turned onto the road leading to a hotel named the Crestwood. It was a discreet 3-star hotel, located just over a mile from where the body was found. A team led by Lieutenant Costello himself immediately went to the Crestwood Hotel. Under the pretext of a routine administrative inspection to avoid raising suspicion, they requested to see the guest ledger and security camera data. And what they found made the entire team hold their breath. The hotel register clearly showed that at 10:30 p.m. on the 18th, Dr. Marcus Thorne had checked into room 305. He was alone. The night clerk, a young woman, after being shown a photo, confirmed it was Dr. Thorne. She remembered him because he was a regular customer, occasionally renting a room by the hour. But the most shocking detail came from her testimony. She recounted that just 15 minutes after Dr. Thorne went up to his room, a very beautiful young woman entered the hotel. This woman did not register but said her boyfriend had already booked a room and went straight up to the 3rd floor. When shown a photo of the victim, Leah Morgan, even though it was an old ID picture, the clerk confirmed with near absolute certainty that it was her. She remembered clearly because the woman was very beautiful and dressed very fashionably. All the pieces had fallen into place. Dr. Thorne had lied. He was not at home, nor was he at the hospital. He had a rendezvous with his mistress at the Crestwood Hotel on the very night she was murdered. This hotel was the primary crime scene, the place where the crime actually occurred. But to convict him, they needed physical evidence. Lieutenant Costello knew that a careful man like Thorne would certainly not leave obvious traces in the hotel room. But he might have missed something. He ordered a re-examination of all the hotel security footage, especially of Thorne when he arrived and when he left. And this time, a horrifying detail, a detail the detectives had initially overlooked, came to light. When reviewing the footage from the security camera in the parking garage of Dr. Thorne's own residential community on the evening of the 18th, they noticed something. Before driving away, Thorne struggled to haul a large travel suitcase, the kind used for long trips, out of his house and wrestled it into the trunk of his car. This was very strange. Why would he need such a large suitcase just to go to a hotel for a few hours? This suspicion was clarified when they watched the footage of Thorne leaving the hotel at nearly 3 a.m. the next morning. The hallway camera recorded him, alone, dragging that same large suitcase out of room 305. But this time, the suitcase looked much heavier. He had to strain, using all his strength, just to pull it along. His effort and his tense, furtive demeanor were clearly captured by the camera. A horrifying truth dawned on everyone. That suitcase was not for clothes. It was the tool he used to move the victim's body. He had strangled Leah to death in the hotel room, then stuffed her body into the suitcase he had prepared in advance. He had dragged the suitcase containing his crime out of the hotel, put it in his car, and driven towards the railroad tracks to carry out the final, barbaric step of his disposal plan. While the investigators were still reeling from the cold calculation of the killer, another report came in, adding another piece of ironclad evidence. Another team, working with the city's taxi companies, had found a driver. This driver confirmed that at a little after 3 a.m. on the 19th, he had picked up a peculiar fare. A very well-dressed man, who looked exactly like Dr. Thorne in the photo, had hailed his cab on a deserted street not far from the Crestwood Hotel. The man asked to be taken to a location near the railroad. What the driver remembered most was that the passenger had an extremely heavy suitcase. He had struggled to lift it into the car, and when he took it out, he also had great difficulty. And the final, decisive piece of evidence was found when the forensics team was ordered to search hotel room 305 again with specialized equipment. This time, they missed nothing. When they lifted the mattress and shone a UV light under the bed, they found a forgotten item. It was a pair of women's high-heeled shoes, shoved deep into a dark corner. After checking with the victim's family, they confirmed these were the shoes Leah had been wearing on the last day she was seen. All the evidence had been assembled: the false statements, the security camera footage, the mysterious suitcase, the taxi driver's testimony, and the abandoned shoes. An unbreakable net had been tightened around the vicious killer. The time for Dr. Marcus Thorne to face justice had come. With a solid, airtight, and irrefutable body of evidence, the task force had sufficient legal grounds for the next procedural step. An arrest and search warrant for Dr. Marcus Thorne was approved by the Chambersburg District Attorney's Office that night. Lieutenant Costello knew the time to force the killer to face justice was ripe. He did not want to give the subject another second to plot or prepare mentally. The more intelligent and respected the perpetrator, the more complex his psychology, and the more a decisive strike was needed, leaving him no opportunity to erect new shields of deceit. At dawn the next day, while the city was still asleep, a special task force quietly arrived at Chambersburg General Hospital. They wore plain clothes and did not use marked cars. They entered the hospital like ordinary patients' family members to avoid unnecessary attention in an already sensitive environment. The plan was to arrest Dr. Thorne immediately after he finished his morning surgery, at a time when he would be most physically exhausted and mentally relaxed. At 11 a.m. sharp, the surgery concluded successfully. Dr. Marcus Thorne, in his green scrubs, walked out of the operating room, his face slightly tired after hours of intense concentration but still exuding the confident authority of a leading surgeon. He was removing his mask and chatting with the nurses about the procedure when Lieutenant Costello and 2 homicide detectives silently approached from behind, blocking his path. Lieutenant Costello's low and clear voice cut through the conversation, addressing Dr. Marcus Thorne by name. The sound, though not loud, carried a weight that made the bustling hallway fall silent. Thorne spun around, startled. When he saw the familiar faces of the police officers, the confidence on his face momentarily froze. But with the composure of someone accustomed to pressure, he quickly regained his usual calm. He asked why they were there again, his tone slightly annoyed. He stated that he had already told them he was very busy and had nothing more to say, trying to act as if he were being unreasonably harassed, as if he were the victim of a mistake. Lieutenant Costello did not say much. He just silently held up the arrest warrant with its official seal in front of Thorne. He informed Thorne that he was under arrest for investigation of murder and that they needed him to cooperate. The moment he saw the arrest warrant, the word murder hitting his eyes, Dr. Thorne's feigned composure shattered completely. His face turned white as a sheet, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The mask he had just removed slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor. The surrounding nurses and colleagues stood frozen, their mouths agape in astonishment, unable to believe what was happening before their eyes. The talented, virtuous doctor they had always respected could not possibly be involved in such a monstrous crime. Without a word of resistance, without another question, Thorne meekly allowed the detectives to handcuff him and lead him away through the crowded hospital corridors. Under hundreds of astonished, curious gazes and whispers, the white coat of a healer was officially stripped away, revealing the true face of a cold-blooded murderer. In the interrogation room at the Chambersburg Police Department, the final confrontation took place. This was not a physical ordeal but a true battle of wits. Initially, even in handcuffs and surrounded by 4 cold walls, Marcus Thorne remained stubborn to the end. He sat silently, back straight, cuffed hands on the table, exercising his right to remain silent, not answering a single question. He was an intelligent man. He knew that as long as he did not confess, without a statement, the investigation would face great difficulties. He believed the circumstantial evidence was not enough to convict him, but he had underestimated the persistence and the trump cards the task force held. Lieutenant Costello was not in a hurry. He signaled for a technician to turn on a large projector aimed at the white wall opposite Thorne. Lieutenant Costello calmly told Thorne that he had the right to remain silent, but the truth did not, and that they would let the images speak for him. The screen lit up. The first video was the security footage from Thorne's residential community, showing him struggling to drag a large travel suitcase out of his house and into his trunk. Lieutenant Costello's voice boomed like a slow, deliberate judgment, noting the time was 10:15 p.m. on the 18th and reminding Thorne that he had said he was at home, sleeping. The second video was from the hotel camera, showing him entering alone, and just 15 minutes later, Leah Morgan walking in. Then came the most damning video, him, alone, straining with all his might to drag that same suitcase out of the hotel room, the suitcase looking significantly heavier than when he brought it in. His furtive, tense demeanor was captured in sharp detail. Thorne began to breathe heavily, sweat drenching his forehead and the back of his shirt. He could not believe the police had managed to collect such detailed footage. Lieutenant Costello's voice drilled into Thorne's conscience as he asked how many extra pounds that suitcase was carrying and what the weight of a 5'3" woman who was 3 months pregnant was. The screen continued. The taxi driver's statement was played over the speakers, describing in detail a well-dressed passenger with an unusually heavy suitcase. Then came the image of Leah's black high-heeled shoes, found by forensic experts under the bed in room 305. Each image, each word, was like another blow from a sledgehammer, relentlessly smashing his stubbornness. When the final video ended, the screen went black, returning the room to a chilling silence. Marcus Thorne had completely broken down. He no longer maintained the elegant, calm demeanor of an intellectual. He slumped forward, his head on the table, his shoulders shaking violently. The sobs of a successful man, a man of status, erupted choked, full of shame and despair. He knew it was over. The perfect play he had painstakingly constructed had been mercilessly torn down. After a long time, when he had stopped crying, he lifted his head, his eyes red and soulless. He admitted that it was him and that he had killed her. The confession had finally been uttered. And then, like a dam breaking, Dr. Marcus Thorne confessed to his entire crime. It was a tragic story of a clandestine love affair, selfishness, and a fear that had turned a healer into a devil. He admitted to having an illicit affair with Leah Morgan for nearly a year. Initially, it was just an adventure to find novelty outside of a marriage he considered dull. But then he developed genuine feelings for the young, beautiful woman. Their relationship grew deeper. The tragedy began when Leah told him she was pregnant. For Leah, this news might have been a source of hope, but for Thorne, it was nothing less than a death sentence hanging over his head. He had a perfect family, a career at its peak, and a reputation he had spent his entire life building. If this pregnancy were revealed, it would destroy everything. Leah had initially agreed to take care of it secretly, but then, perhaps driven by love and a desire for legitimacy, she changed her mind. She began to pressure Thorne, demanding he divorce his wife and marry her. The breaking point came on November 18th, when Leah arranged to meet him at the Crestwood Hotel and gave him an ultimatum. Either he make their relationship public and take responsibility for her and the baby, or she would go to his wife and his hospital and tell them everything. That evening, when he went to the hotel, Thorne already had a sinful contingency plan in his mind. He brought the suitcase, claiming it was for a sudden business trip, but it was actually in preparation for the worst-case scenario. In the hotel room, a furious argument erupted. Leah's threats struck at his deepest fears. In a moment of absolute panic, with his reason clouded by fear, he lost control. When Leah turned her back, he lunged from behind, using a braided fabric phone charging cable that he always carried in his bag, and pulled it tight around her neck. He squeezed and squeezed until her body went limp and collapsed to the floor. After committing the act, his panic quickly transformed into the cold calculation of a surgeon. He knew what he had to do to erase the traces. He calmly stuffed Leah's body into the suitcase. He cursorily cleaned the scene but, in his haste, left her shoes under the bed. Then, he dragged the suitcase containing the body out of the hotel, took a taxi near the railroad tracks, and waited, calculating the time for the freight train's arrival. He then dragged the suitcase out and placed the victim's body on the rails. He believed the tremendous force of the train would destroy everything, turning her and the baby into an anonymous suicide, and he would be able to continue his perfect life. Dr. Marcus Thorne's confession, though anticipated, still sent a profound shock through the entire task force. It was not just the statement of a killer but the self-admission of an intellectual, a doctor, about the complete collapse of his humanity in the face of fear and selfishness. The case was essentially solved, but to complete the file and ensure a legally airtight case for prosecution, one final, crucial investigative step was taken: a crime scene reenactment. A few days later, Marcus Thorne, dressed in a grey-striped prison jumpsuit, was escorted back to the Crestwood Hotel, the place where he had turned a secret rendezvous into a hell on earth. Security at the hotel was tightened. The reenactment took place inside room 305 under the supervision of a representative from the district attorney's office and was carefully filmed and photographed. Standing in the room where he had committed the murder, Thorne no longer resembled the dignified, calm doctor of before. He trembled, his face pale, avoiding everyone's gaze. Using a life-size mannequin, he mechanically reenacted his entire criminal act. He replayed the argument, the struggle, and then the horrific moment he wrapped the phone cord around his lover's neck from behind and pulled tight. He described the victim's weak resistance and the terrifying silence when her body went limp. The most gruesome part of the reenactment was when he had to demonstrate the disposal. He opened the suitcase and, with the cold calm of a surgeon, he arranged the mannequin inside. It was an act that showed extreme calculation and utter lack of emotion. Then he dragged the suitcase out of the room, down the elevator, recreating the entire route he had taken on the night of the murder. Every reenacted action by Thorne was another knife thrust, deepening the cruel and inhuman nature of the killer. With the detailed confession, the perfectly corresponding results of the crime scene reenactment, and the irrefutable physical evidence, the Chambersburg Police Department issued its final investigative report. The case file was comprehensively completed, recommending the prosecution of Dr. Marcus Thorne for first-degree murder, with multiple aggravating circumstances such as killing a person he had a duty of care for, killing a woman known to be pregnant, committing the crime in a cruel manner, and acting with a depraved motive. The entire case file, evidence, and the defendant were then transferred to the County District Attorney's Office. Based on the solid evidence, the DA quickly issued an indictment, bringing Marcus Thorne to trial before the County Court of Common Pleas. The trial began on a late winter day in 2018, attracting extraordinary national media attention. The case of a doctor murdering his pregnant lover and staging a suicide had caused a massive public outcry. The courtroom was packed with reporters and the public. On the defendant's side, Thorne's wife and elderly parents were present, their faces etched with pain, shame, and devastation. On the victim's side, David Morgan, Leah's husband in name, also sat quietly in the front row, his eyes empty and soulless. In the defendant's box, Marcus Thorne no longer maintained his cold, calm exterior. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken, constantly staring at the floor, avoiding all gazes. He admitted to all criminal acts as stated in the indictment. The Assistant District Attorney presented the damning case for the prosecution. The prosecutor deeply analyzed the defendant's criminal psychological progression, from a respected, educated man of status who slid down a slippery slope in an extramarital affair, to a man who, when his secret was threatened, chose to solve one sin with an even more horrific crime. The evidence from security cameras, the suitcase, the shoes, witness testimony, and the DNA results of the fetus were all presented, forming a legal net with no holes. Speaking in court, David Morgan could not hold back his emotions. His voice trembling, he told the judge that he stood there not just as the victim's husband, but as a man who had been completely broken. He had lost his wife, and more bitterly, he had learned she was carrying another man's child just before she died. This pain was unbearable. But the one who caused all this tragedy, the one who callously took 2 lives, was a doctor, an educated man. He only asked that the court deliver a sentence that was just and severe, that fit the crime the defendant had committed, to bring justice for his wife, for her unborn child, and to deter others. In his final statement, Marcus Thorne broke down in tears. He offered a belated apology to Leah's family, to his wife and his children. He said that in a moment of panic, terrified of losing everything, he had committed a monstrous crime. He begged for the court's mercy. However, his tears and apology at this point were worthless. They could not erase the savage crime he had committed. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, and the judge delivered the final sentence. The court found the defendant Marcus Thorne's actions to be exceptionally heinous, carried out with direct intent, premeditation, and preparation, demonstrating extreme cruelty and a complete loss of humanity. The defendant, as a doctor and an intellectual, should have understood the value of human life better than anyone. But merely to protect his own reputation, status, and family life, he had mercilessly murdered his lover and his own unborn child. His sophisticated and cunning act of disposing of the body to frame the victim for suicide further demonstrated his depravity and utter contempt for the law. The defendant was deemed beyond rehabilitation and needed to be permanently removed from society. On that basis, the court sentenced the defendant, Marcus Thorne, to the maximum penalty, death. As the sentence was read, the entire courtroom fell silent, then erupted in sighs of relief and the choked sobs of the families. Upon hearing his fate, Marcus Thorne's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor. The highest penalty of the law had been served, closing the chapter on the life of a talented but sinful doctor. This case is a costly lesson on the devastating consequences of extramarital affairs. It shows that when people allow selfishness and the fear of losing what they have to cloud their reason, they can become more cruel than any demon. Marcus Thorne had it all: a happy family, a brilliant career, and the respect of society. But in his desperate attempt to protect that perfect facade at all costs, he single-handedly destroyed everything, taking 2 innocent lives with him and leaving behind scars that would never heal for those who remained. Justice was served, but the tragedy of the doctor with the face of a monster will forever remain a cautionary tale.